This week we will be looking at the infamous man Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, who you see a portrait of here. So Caravaggio's training is in the Milanese tradition in the years before he leaves for Rome. Milan was a Spanish dominion in Caravaggio's time. It had passed to Philip II of Spain when his father invaded Italy in the decades earlier, and a Spanish governor was appointed to the city. So it was the Spanish seat of power from which the Sforza family had ruled. There was great famine there and then plague that I mentioned in the years surrounding Caravaggio's birth. And the annals of this period recount that many died in Milan during this time. In fact, it's probable that Caravaggio was sent back to the city of Caravaggio to avoid the plague. In any case, he starts to learn and adapt the style of the artist he's working with in Milan, which is Simone Pieterzano. Pieterzano was an artist who was greatly influenced by Titian, and he had traveled to Venice, and he was supposedly a student of Titian. And we see some of that influence in the background here, and also the handling of the bodies, the way that they're modeled by light. And the figure of this woman here, Angelica, has a very Titian-esque aspect, a kind of this soft light and soft hands, golden hair. It has a Venetian style to it in the handling, as well as the tree behind them. Pieterzano probably also knew the work of other Venetian artists like Tintoretto and Veronese, and would have been familiar with the work of Correggio and Barocci, and was inspired by a tradition of naturalism, which had already taken hold in Lombardy and Milan, especially as evolution of the Da Vinci style of chiaroscuro. So he's sort of blending the Tuscan with the Venetian. This story, Angelica and Medoro, comes from a 16th century book called Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto. Angelica is an Asian princess from the court of Charlemagne who fell in love with a Saracen knight, Medoro, and elopes with him to China. She first encounters him wounded by Scottish knights along with his friends who were killed. That's them in the background. So it's a story of love that's being presented to us that comes from a context that is outside of the sacred and in the secular world, secular writing. Ludovico Ariosto. Naturalism is also a part of the legacy of Simone Pieterzano, and this is where we get some of that interest in the Leonardesque kind of obsession about rendering nature very faithfully. In Milan, it would still have been possible to study the Virgin of the Rocks by Leonardo da Vinci during the time that Pieterzano and Caravaggio are there. The Last Supper would have been available to them. So there are many followers of Leonardo in northern Italy at this time. And that's some of the backdrop in which Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio is operating. By the age of 21, Caravaggio, as he's known by almost everybody, was done with his training in Milan. But the art record is mysteriously silent from this period. We don't know exactly why he left the town of Milan. There are some who think that it might be because of his temper and he got in trouble for being overly violent, just violent in general, traits that he exhibits in Rome later on. One of his biographers, there are three early biographers of Caravaggio: Giulio Mancini, the earliest, Gian Pietro Bellori, and Giovanni Baglione. And Mancini says that he had to leave Milan because they committed a crime. So it's possible that Caravaggio was involved in some sort of brawl for which, he was eventually forced to leave. But the point is, he goes to the city of Rome in 1591-92, and this is a town that is very much alive with art commissions and building projects and an interest in making art that is incredibly engaging and pious to bring people back into the Catholic fold of the church. New buildings are being constructed. And several of them are churches. New streets are being built so that the basilicas of Rome can be linked to each other. Water sources, like where aqueducts had initially brought water in antiquity, are now being reopened and decorated with pretty fantastic sculptural fountains in the years that are preceding Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio's arrival in the city. We have the Christianization of ancient monuments, of obelisks throughout the town. So it's a vibrant place whose population is starting to grow. Things are starting to change there. Caravaggio's acquaintances and connections may also be a reason why he went to Rome initially. Usually an artist needs a protector when they go to a new city, and Caravaggio's first years here are not very well documented because he did not have a solid protector. Instead, he did a lot of cheap jobs. He wasn't paid a lot for them. Devotional images, copies of other works, still lifes of fruits and flowers. We know that he changed lodgings frequently during this time, at least 10 times in his first years here. So there's evidence of poverty and a lack of connection with the city of Rome, but also a kind of ambition starts to emerge within this environment. In these early years, this is the time that he produced paintings of genre subjects. We'll look at a couple of these in a moment here. The Boy with a Basket of Fruit, Boy Bitten by a Lizard, Bacchus and Sick Bacchus, but the chronology of them is unclear. These were probably produced for the open market with the expectation of hawking his talents, but an artistic space that was typically perceived as somewhat undignified. For example, the Roman Academy di San Luca, which was the artists' academy, forbid its members from working in the free market. During this time, Caravaggio works with Antividuto Grammatica, who is a Sienese artist, someone from Siena. He works with a Sicilian artist, Lorenzo Siciliano. And he eventually starts working with the Cavaliere di Arpino, Giuseppe Cesari, who we've seen the work of in the Chiesa Nuova in Rome earlier in this class. And you see a work of the Cavaliere di Arpino here. So this is the type of painting that would have been popular in Di Arpino's workshop and that might have inspired Caravaggio to take on these genre subjects because they sold well in this open market scenario. This one's actually in Connecticut. And this is another type, this is actually by Caravaggio, of painting that he would have likely produced while he was in the workshop of the Cavaliere di Arpino. This was eventually acquired by Scipione Borghese when he tried to buy these paintings off of the Cavaliere di Arpino. He offered too low of a sum that was insulting to the artist. So di Arpino refused to sell. And then Scipione had him arrested on trumped up charges and then took all 107 paintings that were in the artist's possession. So that's how this ended up in the Galleria Borghese. Not a very nice thing to do on the cardinal's behalf, but he was a fervent supporter of Caravaggio, so it's to be expected, perhaps. Here we are presented with a boy who's holding this very common-looking basket of fruit, mostly, and some leaves attached to these ripening and maybe overly ripened fruits. The skin of this boy is glowing and hit by this sort of radiant light, creating a rosy effect. He's clutching this basket, but his head leaning back in this way sort of offers it to us. You can see that Caravaggio's characteristic light source, very spotlight effect, is visible in this painting as well. We have this shaft of light that's coming in and spotlighting our character. The fruits appear mostly fresh. There's a slight curling at the edges of the leaves, and you can see this one's not looking so fresh anymore. The cherries shine and the grapes are transparent. When we look at the boy's face, we see he has this parted mouth, which makes us think of immediacy, and maybe he's about to say something or has just uttered something. It seems to hearken from a time long past. The 17th century is removed. We don't have elements that really tie us to the past. It's the type of painting that Caravaggio would have produced in Cesari's studio. An evidence of a legacy of Caravaggio in the Di Arpino workshop. Here's another example of an early work by Caravaggio. This one was bought by Del Monte, Cardinal Francesco Del Monte. It has a scene that is sort of deliberately provocative because we see here temptations evidenced of gambling and games. The painting is full of brilliant color and combines the ideal with the interest in naturalistic representation. It's a deliberately provocative subject, and it offers up a scene of vice. Gambling, what we see taking place here with cards, and things are not going very well for the young boy who is playing this game, who we see is being cheated. Caravaggio's painting is topical. There were people in the late 16th century who were well known as cheats, and so this is something of a warning against the dangers that beset the gullibility of youth, a scene of cheating in a somewhat theatrical way. Indeed, a catalog of tricks was published, cheating tricks was published in Cospi's Il Giudice Criminalista of 1643, where such tactics as cards thick with colors so that they had more bulk and could be pulled out of the deck more easily were published. Or this technique of having someone stand behind the person that you're playing and work with another as an accomplice so that he nods and winks and about the cards that are in the innocent prey's hands. So this was a relevant topic at the time. In 1588, the Pope Sixtus V had issued an edict against gambling, banning dice gambling, and had levied a tax on card players. So the whole idea of playing this was seen as sinful and a portent of disaster. And yet gaming was incredibly popular. So there's these ironies and there are these ironies and contrasting elements of everyday life in Rome. The figures here are somewhat bedraggled. They have odd bits of finery like weapons, but there's holes in this man's glove, for example. So we have this kind of contrast of attempting to look very fine against actual finery. All of this shows us the life of the tavern world, but rendered in the realm of comedy and theater, displayed for the delight of the court being the people who are looking at this, that this is bought by Cardinal Francesco del Monte, who probably gambled in his private life, but also would have known that this happened outside of his home in the street. This would have made it sort of this accessible version of taking on those risks of transgression, accessible transgression. At that point, it appears that Caravaggio joins the house of this cardinal, Francesco del Monte, and goes to live with him at his palace in the center of Rome, which you see here at the Palazzo Madama. Del Monte was an incredibly well-connected man. He was involved in lots of various circles in Rome. He knew lots of patrons. He was born in Venice, and his father had been in the service of the Della Rovere family of Urbino, which is where Francesco was educated. He later became good friends with the Duke Ferdinando de' Medici, and so he's involved outside of Rome with the Duchy of Tuscany as well. And so here's the palace in which Caravaggio is invited to live in his 20s, very close to the Pantheon, which we see here, and to Piazza Navona, where Bernini's famous fountain will eventually be constructed. And here's a view of Palazzo Madama, which had been outfitted by Del Monte as a salon for music. He had a collection of books of science, musical instruments. He collected oriental carpets and, of course, art. He eventually owned some 600 pictures and over 50 sculptures in marble. He had a collection of cameos, medals, bronzes, and gems. He may have owned a copy of a Giorgione painting and had a Titian, or a copy of Titian's Mary Magdalene before Caravaggio moved in. So importantly, this is an environment that offered Caravaggio connections of an intellectual nature with connoisseurs and men of letters, as well as access to a level of fine arts. And here's just a view of him. So this is probably the first painting that's done by Caravaggio expressly for Del Monte. It suggests that Caravaggio might have found some connection in this remote and refined courtly world. He's painting a set of musicians, which is something that he probably saw when he was living with Del Monte. Baldione writes that Baldione is one of Caravaggio's biographers. He writes that Caravaggio painted this from life. 2 models seem to be used. We see similar features in these 2 figures and similar haircuts in these 2, although they're painted from different points of view. It is them prepping for a concert, probably in one of the chambers of Palazzo Madama. And the power of music is the theme, and in particular to arouse erotic desire and to convey human passion. They're sort of vaguely mythological. They look like, they're coming to us from kind of classical times. We don't have a 17th century or late 16th century environment presented to us here. And we even have one of them dressed up as a Cupid who's tending to the grapes here. This kind of combines together to remind us that music combined with wine lifts the spirits. In another early painting done while in Del Monte's palace, Caravaggio presents us with a Bacchus who offers us a glass of wine, has this kind of seductive element to the painting because it's addressing the viewer very forthrightly. Wine has the vibrations of movement still represented in it as these little liquid waves that are cascading out from the inside and moving to the sides of the glass. It's an incredibly confident presentation of glass to that point too. So we see this interest in still life and naturalistic representations presented to us here. It's not really idealized in the sense that Caravaggio's figure here has a kind of ruddy skin tone against this whiter flesh of his shoulders and chest. In a classically natural representation, you would see uniform skin color throughout, and we don't get that here. So we're pulled into this painting and we're offered this glass of wine, and at the same time we can see that there's not quite all that it's not quite all that it seems, or things are not exactly as they seem here, because this bowl of fruit that's sitting on the table in front of this figure of Bacchus is not just ripe, but like starting to rot. So what really is he offering to us? Is it just drink, or are we sensing the vice of wine as well? And furthermore, by exposing the pillow here and the kind of theatricality of this painting altogether, we're kind of questioning, is this a real figure from antiquity? Are we meant to think that this is actually Bacchus? Or are we looking at a picture of Bacchus dressed up, or a boy dressed up as Bacchus? The contradiction of those two ideas is part of this. And this is a hallmark of Caravaggio. His paintings are often ambiguous, and that's part of what makes them so interesting to us still today, is that they're not easily resolved. They're not just check marks on our list of museum pieces. We can puzzle over them still, which makes them very exciting to look at. This one was painted on commission for a banker, wealthy banker called Ottavio Costa, and the canvas is mentioned in his will of 1632. He was said to have been very fond of this painting and apparently kept it hidden behind a satin curtain, which is not so different from the painted curtain that we see in the background of this painting itself. Costa had long been an admirer of Caravaggio and had earlier on commissioned the Connecticut Wadsworth Athenaeum painting from him in 1595 of St. Francis of Assisi in ecstasy. He was a person who had been involved with the transferring of monies to Caravaggio from other patrons like the Mattei, the Vitrice, and the Colonna as well. So he's a person in Caravaggio's sort of medium inner circle. He's someone that he would have known. The painting depicts Judith beheading Holofernes, which is an image that you're probably familiar with, or a story that you're probably familiar with, in which this Old Testament heroine Judith takes on the task herself of defending her hometown from the advancing armies of the Assyrian general Holofernes. And to do so, she's got to make his troops leaderless by killing him. And she suspects also that her husband has been killed by his troops. So she has this kind of agenda to seduce and kill him in his tent by sneaking into his tent. And that's a scene that has been represented throughout art history in a much more iconic way, where we see Judith already having killed Holofernes and just holding his head, or maybe sneaking into his tent, but we don't typically see represented the actual scene of beheading. So this is where Caravaggio's naturalism and intensity comes through to us through his decision to choose this particular part of the story. It's often read as in contrast with Artemisia Gentileschi's later interpretation of this subject matter, and she did a number of paintings on this. But if we just focus on this painting itself, since it comes first, we have this disruption of standard iconography, and we have the representation of Judith, who looks perhaps you could read as trepidatious at first, but perhaps is best read as revulsion. She's repelled by what she's doing, and yet knows that this is the thing she has to do to save her people from his military campaign. She's got her servant Abra next to her. So we have a third figure in the painting who looks very stern and determined. And I think the two read together indicate important elements of the Old Testament story. Caravaggio based the portrait of Judith on his mistress Filide Melendroni, who features in a number of his works. Oh, one other thing about this painting. It has an interesting story. It sort of disappeared for 300 years after 1632, and then appeared only in 1951 when a restorer was tasked with restoring it and had alerted a Caravaggio scholar, Roberto Longhi, and then it's eventually purchased by the state. And if you want to go see it now, you have to go to Rome, because it's at the major gallery of Renaissance and Baroque works in that city. So it has a kind of dramatic story for a very dramatic subject. In July of 1599, on the eve of the Jubilee, or the Holy Year, that was being conducted by Pope Clement VIII, Caravaggio was commissioned to paint a pair of lateral wall canvases for the chapel of the late Mathieu Contrel, his French name, or Matteo Contorelli, his Italianized name, who was a French cardinal, and was buried in the French National Church that you see here, San Luigi dei Francesi, St. Louis of the French, in Rome. And the commission is dated originally to 1565, but had been renewed in 1591 when Cardinal's heirs asked Giuseppe Cesare di Arpino, the Cavaliere di Arpino, to complete the work. But by 1599, he hadn't done anything but the frescoed scenes in the vault. And so Cardinal del Monte, who lived very nearby this building, along with Clement VIII, helped to recommend Caravaggio to do the work. By July 4th, 1600, the paintings of the Calling of St. Matthew and the Martyrdom of St. Matthew had been installed in the city, in the chapel. And this was perhaps Caravaggio's most important piece in his life, because it debuted him to the public, and it challenged him to do a set of paintings that were incredibly large, the largest works that he had ever done. So it was a space for him to really exhibit his burgeoning talent. The challenge was that Caravaggio had never painted a picture with more than 4 people in it. His paintings were also typically done on a much smaller format than that required here. Up to this time, they had been only 4 feet wide, and here these are 11 feet wide. And he hadn't done anything of such great narrative scenes in his life. So this was very different than the genre scenes and still lifes that he was working on in previous projects. Just like the ambiguity that we talked about with the Bacchus, we see a kind of ambiguity here as well, because in this Calling of St. Matthew, which features Christ indicating the moment of conversion to Christianity of St. Matthew, who was a tax collector, we have a kind of interesting ambiguity throughout the painting. We can ask ourselves, where are we here? Are we inside or are we outside? Italian homes had and still have shutters on both sides of the house, with the inside and the outside of windows. We can ask ourselves about, are we in Caravaggio's present in 1600 Rome? Because we have figures who are dressed in a customary garb of the time, or are we in the Rome of Christ, as we've got figures who are dressed that way too? Are we to think that Christ is calling this man here? And I believe that yes, this is St. Matthew, or this is become St. Matthew. This is what people thought at the time. This is how Bellori viewed it, one of Caravaggio's biographers. So we have this kind of interest piqued by the way that Caravaggio has conceived of the scene, which is incredibly different, understatement, but incredibly different from the way that pieces were being composed before him. You can also see that light is coming in ways that are similar to the way that they come into the painting. So the painting enters into our actual world. It corresponds to the chapel in which it's located. Caravaggio was also riffing off of and in conversation with Michelangelo, his namesake, Buonarroti, taking forms and cues from this great Florentine and Roman artist, like the hand, the gestures that Christ is making, borrowing from the gesture of Adam here. The calling of St. Matthew is the start of Matthew's story, while the martyrdom is the end of it. So here we have all the aspects, sort of like a big set of canvas parentheses on the wall. Note that in this view, you can also see somewhat well the Cavaliere di Arpino's frescoes on the ceiling, and what a different style they are from what Caravaggio was doing. In the martyrdom of St. Matthew, the story tells of the saint's heroic martyrdom, who's killed by sword while in the act of baptizing and conducting mass. He shows us, Caravaggio, cowards who are recoiling in horror at the terrible thing that's taking place. And I say coward because we get people running away who aren't stopping the murder of this saint. And one of those figures, this man in the background, is Caravaggio himself, which is an inclusion of his portrait that will become a commonplace in Caravaggio's paintings. Oops, let's go back to that. The other semi-nude men here in the foreground that are around this floor baptismal font can be read as accomplices potentially, or as people who are preparing to be baptized. According to the Golden Legend, which is a book from the medieval time that chronicled the lives of saints. The sword that killed St. Matthew struck him on the back while he was celebrating Mass. But here we have a reversal of that, where we see the saint disarmed on the floor. He's already been stabbed once, and the blood is starting to go through his robes. And he's kind of got this pose that opens himself up. He's really vulnerable to his assailant. And at the same time, he's receiving the palm of martyrdom that's coming down from this angel who's doing this very balletic or yoga-like pose here on this set of clouds coming in. So Caravaggio's changing the narrative a little bit from the way that has been typically conceived of. Indeed, I can show you a line drawing from the mosaics at the Church of San Marco in Venice that show the martyrdom of St. Matthew here, and you can see he's being stabbed in the back, or being hit in the back by the sword. The Calling of St. Matthew was also repainted by Caravaggio. He had conceived of a different array of figures in his original version of the piece, and this he painted on top of it. So you can make out in this X-ray that's got some outlines here that make it easier to see. The figures are smaller, much smaller than they end up eventually being. And we've got the assailant here with the sword over his head, and he hasn't yet seemed to have struck the saint who's here. And we've got other people who are sort of aiding in this process, and other assailants. So he narrows down and focuses the drama in the final. Caravaggio was commissioned to do all three of the walls of this chapel, and this is the second version of the scene of the Inspiration of St. Matthew, which is a slightly smaller, narrower canvas anyways, to fit the altar piece of the center wall. Now, this is actually the second version of the scene that Caravaggio painted of this subject matter. The first one was rejected by the commissioners of the project. As you can see here, there are candles and crucifix in the foreground, and those are placed on top of an altar. The positioning of the original altarpiece was such that right at this level, there was the foot, and it was dirty, of St. Matthew projecting into the space. And that's not all. Here's a photograph of the original that was destroyed in the Allied air bombing of Dresden in World War II. Of Berlin in World War II. Matthew is shown also as illiterate. He's kind of this country bumpkin whom the angel has to help to hold a stylus and to write. He doesn't even know what he's doing. This angel's sort of intervening to help him with everything. And here's the offending foot that was indecorously positioned right at the base of the painting. That would have been synonymous with this area over here. So yeah, there's a different attempt done in the second version that makes this a more appropriate conception of the painting. And in the final version, you can see he's re-employing some components of his painting. He reuses the same bench for the saint that we see in the Calling of St. Matthew. And in the Inspiration of St. Matthew, you also see that this altarpiece also has this like tension in it, because it's a little hard to make out here, but this bench is actually kind of falling off of the floor. It's sort of its two legs out here are not resting on floor anymore, so it's cantilevered out. And it's kind of maybe this inclusion of tension in the painting from the tension presented in the original.